Map time! This is Canada. Canada is enormous. Canada is the second largest country in the world by area. Its provinces and territories stretch from the Yukon Territory and British Columbia in the west, all the way to Labrador and Newfoundland in the east. And the eastern parts of Canada are way further east than you think they are. There is a whole time zone in Canada that is an hour further east than the time zone on the U.S. East Coast. And then beyond that, there's another one that's even further east for Newfoundland alone, and that's one of those weird half-hour time zones. Canada is huge. But the Canadian province that sits roughly on top of the state of Montana is the Canadian province of Alberta. And earlier this month, just outside a place called Zama City in northern Alberta, there was a plane full of oil company officials flying over that part of the province, and they noticed that there was something wrong. They noticed that an oil pipeline had burst, even though nobody had heard anything about it. An Alberta oil pipeline that was being operated by a Texas company called Apache was just leaking all over the place. The spill was first noticed that day by company officials flying, so they noticed it from the air. They, in turn, notified the government of Alberta. But something weird happened after they notified the government of Alberta. Nobody said anything. The company and the government just kept quiet about the whole thing for days and days and days and days and days. The spill was first spotted from the air on June 1st. It was not until 11 days later, on June 12th, that the government finally said anything publicly about the fact that it had happened. Some local residents actually learned about the spill before the government announcement, quote, after somebody reported it to a local TV station. But the rest of the public was essentially left in the dark. Asked why they kept quiet about the whole thing that entire time, an official for the oil company told a local reporter up there, quote, it didn't affect people in general. There wasn't anybody harmed. There wasn't anybody that was directly affected. That is not at all true. Here's what that spill looks like. Just oil and wastewater and toxic goo everywhere, right? As you can tell, this is a heavily wooded area. This is actually an environmentally sensitive wetlands region that a local Indian tribe relies on for hunting and trapping and their basic survival. A chief for that tribe told the local paper that every plant and tree died in the area that was touched by the spill. The newspaper describes it this way: across a broad expanse of northern Alberta, the landscape is dead. This spill, which the oil company and the local government decided to not inform the general public about for 11 days after they knew about it, turns out to be giant. Turns out to be one of the largest spills of its kind in recent history. It covers an area of more than 100 acres. 9.5 million liters of this toxic goo has been released. And even though the oil company has insisted publicly that what was spilled was not actually that harmful, they say it's mostly just salt water. Trust us. The images that have been released by those who actually live in the area seem to show a heck of a lot more oil mixed in with all that supposed fresh, clean salt water that was spewing out of the pipeline. In response to this spill, there was a lot of initial questioning about whether enough was being done to maintain the aging oil infrastructure in that area, whether all these old pipelines were meeting the necessary safety standards, whether more should be done, whether more should be invested for safety's sake in replacing all the old stuff. And that worry is why it freaked everybody out so much when they realized that this big disaster in Alberta was not because of the old stuff. The pipeline that failed and that took those 100 acres with it when it failed, that pipeline was only 5 years old. It was a 5-year-old pipeline designed to last for 30 years. It didn't even make it 1/6 of the way through its expected lifespan. A spokesman for the oil company said it was, quote, kind of puzzling as to why the pipeline leaked. We have no idea. I wonder why that happened. Pipeline spills have become a fairly common thing in North America, not just in Canada, but here as well. There was, of course, the big Exxon pipeline spill that took place earlier this year in Mayflower, Arkansas. That was actually an aging pipeline. None of the residents in the area knew their houses were on top of a pipeline, but it was there. That burst pipeline that sent oil flowing through the streets like a wave. That pipeline that burst in Arkansas was nearly 65 years old. There was also the giant Yellowstone River oil spill in Montana, July 2011. That was also an Exxon pipeline. That one fouled one of Montana's legendary natural assets. Then there was the Enbridge oil spill right near the Kalamazoo River in Michigan in 2010. That one has taken years to clean up. Cleanup costs are up to $1 billion and counting so far, in part because that's Alberta tar sands oil, and nobody really knows how to clean up Alberta tar sands oil. But up in Alberta, up in the oil fields up there, it's the Red Deer River, a major source of drinking water for the province, that the oil spills have been fouling lately. Oil spills have been fouling a lot up there for a long time. The network of oil infrastructure and pipelines through Alberta have had an average of 2 crude oil spills of some kind or another every single day for the past 37 years. 2 spills a day. And it is easy to conclude that that's Canada's problem to deal with, right? But President Obama right now has to decide whether that is going to be our problem, too. President Obama personally has to make a decision very soon about whether or not to approve construction of the Keystone XL pipeline that will carry oil from Alberta, Canada, all the way through the United States from our northern border to the Gulf of Mexico. That project requires a presidential permit in order to go forward because that pipeline crosses the international border with Canada. The company that's trying to get that presidential approval to build the pipeline is a company called TransCanada. TransCanada's public pitch about why President Obama should approve their permit immediately is all about how safe this pipeline is going to be.
We can build a safe pipeline. This will be the safest pipeline that has ever been built in the United States. And I don't think that the process needs to take this long.
This will be the safest pipeline that has ever been built. That was the CEO of TransCanada. They're going to make this as safe as houses, right? This week, we learned maybe not. TransCanada has reportedly decided to reject the latest, most state-of-the-art technology that is out there for catching oil leaks in pipelines. There is a system out there of infrared sensors and fiber optic cables that are laid outside the pipeline in order to detect a spill as soon as it happens. That system exists. That sort of technology, in fact, has officially been recommended by the U.S. government for this particular pipeline project. But TransCanada says, actually, we're good. We're not going to do that. They say employing that sort of technology would be impractical for this project, so they're just not going to do it. Yes, they said they would be the, safest pipeline ever, but not that safe. The spill detection systems that they are planning on using have what's called a spotty record of catching leaks, according to the U.S. Department of Transportation. But TransCanada is apparently just going to go with the spotty record stuff anyway, instead of the state-of-the-art stuff. That sort of attitude toward safety on this project is part of why there is so much political consternation and attention and protests when it comes to this one particular pipeline. And, honestly, this would not be the only pipeline in the United States. It's not like we don't have others. We've already got more than 19 million gallons of oil moving around the country by that means every single day. But this project and a few others like it would add another 5 million gallons a day to what we've got already, which would be a big increase. There's also consternation here because this pipeline is huge. It crosses the whole country. It essentially cuts the entire country in half. And in so doing, it runs through a lot of really important, very large sources of American drinking water and groundwater, which has caused concerns even among pro-oil Republican governors and legislators who find their jurisdictions to be along the planned route. Honestly, the other reason this is such a hot-button political issue is the fact of who gets to make the decision. Because it crosses an international boundary, this is on President Obama personally to make the decision. It is his thumbs up or his thumbs down as to whether or not we can bear the risk of this thing as a country. So the fact that this company is not even trying to lower the risk as much as they could, that does ratchet up the pressure even further in terms of whether or not the president is going to approve this thing. As does the president's own insistence on keeping the issue of the environment and climate change at the top of his agenda, on the list of things that he says he wants to do something about in his second term. He keeps saying that over and over again in all of these high-profile speeches, even with Congress saying they have no interest at all in helping him work on it. Today was just the latest instance of President Obama doing that. The president traveled to the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin to give a speech. He stood under the broiling hot sun, wiping sweat off his brow. He had a broken teleprompter, forced him to read his speech off a paper. The president said at the Brandenburg Gate, we must confront the crisis of climate change before it is too late.
The grim alternative affects all nations. More severe storms, more famine and floods, new waves of refugees, coastlines that vanish, oceans that rise. This is the future we must avert. This is the global threat of our time.
Global threat of our time. That was today in Germany. But it echoes exactly what the president said in the longest treatment of any policy issue in his inaugural address earlier this year, when he said, "We will respond to the threat of climate change, knowing that the failure to do so would betray our children and future generations." Some may still deny the overwhelming judgment of science, but none can avoid the devastating impact of raging fires and crippling drought and more powerful storms. America cannot resist this transition, he said. We must lead it. The president followed up those strong words with even more talk about climate change during his State of the Union address, which was a few weeks later. But from that, we have one very interesting political point. So the president is very publicly urging action on this issue, saying that we've got to do something on this. But behind closed doors, he has apparently been telling sort of a different story. He has been apparently acknowledging the very real political dangers in choosing to act on this issue. This is according to reporting from the Washington Post. They say that during a recent private fundraiser in California, quote, President Obama expressed concerns about the political pain involved, saying that dial testing of his State of the Union speech showed that the favorability ratings plummeted when he vowed to act on climate change if Congress refused to do so. So interesting that dial testing would show people not liking the idea of the president saying he would act on this if Congress didn't. But even more interesting that President Obama is telling his donors that at fundraisers when he's explaining to them what's going to happen in the second term. So behind closed doors, President Obama acknowledging that acting alone on this issue, because Congress won't, carries with it a certain amount of political risk. But acting alone, even with that acknowledged political risk, one that's clearly enough on his mind that he's talking about it in unscripted moments, even with that, it is apparently what he intends to do. Because paired with this speech at the Brandenburg Gate today, the White House now says that as soon as next week, we should expect a major presidential address announcing new policy on the issue of climate change. None of these new policy efforts will require any money from Congress or any legislative action from Congress. This is the president acting on his own. The president, we are told, will be acting directly, despite what he was telling everybody privately about his worries about the dial testing. So how does President Obama weigh the strategy here? And are there lessons from how previous presidents have dealt with strategic dilemmas like this that may be informing what he is about to do?